atomic power was given by the mighty hand of God. Atomic power, atomic power. It was given by the mighty hand of God.
Welcome to the 19th episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. Victory at Last, Part 2. When Germany unconditionally surrendered and victory in Europe, or VE Day, was announced on May 8, 1945, American GIs were in a mood to celebrate. For Russell Darks in France and Charlie Toole in London, it was an unforgettable night of celebrations. But in Germany, Murray Shapiro found that German civilians had nothing to celebrate, and all was quiet. Tom Carr wanted to celebrate, but he was too busy recovering from war injuries in a Czechoslovakian hospital. Within days of VE Day, Tom Morse had to establish a camp for German POWs and civilian refugees who now numbered in the thousands. Lloyd Huggins was already questioning whether the Soviet soldiers, our so-called allies, were any better than the Germans we defeated when he was kept awake all night by the screams of German women being raped in the Soviet-occupied quarter. Harry Koty figured he was pretty lucky. His 97th Infantry Division was one of the first to be sent home to the U.S. Then he learned they were sent home so quick so they could be redeployed in the Pacific. But his luck continued. En route, the Japanese surrendered, and Koty had an enviable assignment once he arrived to occupied Japan, guarding a house full of Geisha girls and preventing GIs from visiting them. The invasion of mainland Japan was expected to be costly for both American and Japanese lives. 370,000 Purple Heart medals were ordered by the U.S. Army in preparation for the invasion. They weren't needed. Instead, the U.S. became the only country in history to drop the atomic bomb, first in Hiroshima, killing 80,000, then in Nagasaki, killing 70,000. Almost all of the dead were civilians. Fearful that more cities would soon be obliterated, Japan quickly surrendered. While the U.S. actions remain controversial even to this day, most GIs supported the decision and credited the dropping of the bombs with saving their lives and that of their buddies. But some GIs saw the dropping of the atomic bombs on innocent civilians as an immoral, dirty act and would have preferred to have kept fighting. In any case, all of the GIs fighting in the Pacific were glad the war was finally over when VJ Day was announced. These stories and more in Part 2 of our Victory at Last episode. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense dependent schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes forest where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II, when not only democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters in their reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with approximately 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom received the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes I taught. To keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes and launched this series of podcasts, which are based upon the book. Russell J. Darks had been reassigned to a training battalion in Champagne, France, when the war ended on May 8, 1945.
What a celebration that night! The French ladies wanted to dance with every American soldier they could find. All you could hear was a chorus meaning of a song named Fine la Guerre, meaning the war is over. Of course, the Americans as well as the French were happy that the war was over.
Jubilant as he was, Dark's thoughts soon turned to a solemn vow that he had made with 3 other C Company officers back in North Africa at the start of the war, during their invasion training. It was a vow he couldn't forget.
In our tent one evening just prior to bedtime, and thinking of what may lay in the future, we agreed that any of us who may survive the war would make a deliberate effort to contact the families of any of us who may not have survived, in order to let them know just what might have happened. The 4 of us making this vow were Captain Horton from Pagadon, South Carolina, Lieutenant Greenlee from Milford, Delaware, Lieutenant Nobles from Macon, Georgia, and Lieutenant Russell Darks from Lebanon, Pennsylvania. Lieutenant Greenlee was killed in action on the 12th of September, 1943, by German mortar fire on a dusty mountain road outside of the town of Maiori, Italy. Captain Horton was killed in action in early December 1943 by German sniper fire on Mount Samaruco, Italy. Little Nobles was killed in action on the 30th of May, 1944, in the vineyards near Velletri, Italy, by German machine gun fire. Russell Darks, by the grace of God, was the only survivor of the 4 of us who made that vow.
When Darks finally returned home, he honored his vow even as he celebrated another that he had taken with his young wife. They spent their honeymoon visiting the families of his 3 fallen comrades, fulfilling his promise to them.
I shall never forget how grateful they were to learn the details of the deaths of their loved ones.
Murray Shapiro of Chatsworth, California, was in Germany when VE Day was announced. It seemed strange to hear ticker tape parades were being held in New York and jubilant celebrations were occurring in England when everything was so quiet in Germany. Shapiro wanted to celebrate, but as he wrote his parents,
"We felt like raising whoopee, and we had the alcoholic methods of doing so, but generally speaking, things were pretty quiet. The civilians don't have anything to celebrate, and we don't have anyone to celebrate with."
Charlie Toole had been assigned to a desk job in London by VE Day. He walked over to Hyde Park and to Buckingham Palace, where he saw Mr. Churchill and the royal family as they waved to thousands of admirers. After escaping any serious injury in combat, Tom Carr spent the last 3 months of the war in a hospital, having suffered a serious concussion and other injuries when the jeep that he was riding to Pilsen turned over.
"The worst part of that was that I missed all the celebrations,"
Carr recalled. Sadly, 50 years later, Carr also missed out on the 50th anniversary celebrations at Normandy, despite being a charter member of the Battle of Normandy Foundation. Like many veterans, it was just too expensive of a trip. When Carr wrote a letter to the New York Post stating that Uncle Sam should invite all of the surviving veterans at no expense to the 50th anniversary celebrations, a travel agent called him and offered to pay all of his expenses. After finding out how expensive and scarce lodging in Paris and Normandy was, the agent called Carr back and told him that she could pay for his airfare but not his lodging. He'd have to be on his own to find a place to stay. Well, that was a deal-breaker for Carr.
"I, of course, thanked her very much, but I didn't want to wander around the country in hopes of finding a places to stay. That's as close as I came to returning to Normandy."
With the war having ended, Tom C. Morris of Waxahachie, Texas, looked forward to some time to relax in Pilsen after many months of combat.
"I had issued orders to my battalion to relax and to stay out of trouble,"
Morris recalled. Instead, Morris, a supply officer, received orders from the regimental command to move east. Morris was asked
to intercept the hordes of military and civilian people moving west on the Pilsen-Prague highway. Our Air Force had observed the movement and radioed into headquarters.
The highway was filled with Germans and Czechs attempting to leave Prague before the Russians moved in there, but Pilsen was already filled with people. I had spent almost 5 years in the army learning how to combat the enemy and to destroy him, Morris recalled. Now I was given the mission of trying to take care of them. I was not prepared for this type of mission. Morris was given deceptively simple orders. He was to keep the refugees out of Pilsen. Morris reassembled his unit and found an open field suitable for gathering people. His unit put a ring of soldiers around the area, not to keep the Germans in, but to keep the Czech people out. Revenge? Over the next 48 hours, some 20,000 to 25,000 German soldiers appeared. Morris remembered. They came in tanks and automobiles, horses, walking. They brought their dead, the wounded, and without medical supplies. As soon as he could, Morris moved them off the road. He secured medical help for the wounded and had the graves registration begin to collect the dead. A former German colonel and master sergeant were recruited to assist in running the camp. Sanitary conditions were a major problem, and sanitary facilities were built as soon as they could be. Within about 10 days, we felt the camp was running pretty good, Morris said. In another 10 days, Morris turned the camp over to another unit when his division was ordered back to the U.S. to begin preparing for the imminent invasion of Japan. Lloyd Huggins of Petersburg, Virginia, understood why the German civilians were so desperate to escape the advancing Russian soldiers. His 60th Infantry Regiment arrived in the German town of Jesnitz on the Mudu River in late April 1945 and were told to wait there until the Russians arrived. Huggins recalled thousands of German civilians and soldiers who were desperately trying to get over to the American side before the Russians came. Huggins' regiment was told to hold a bridge and prevent the Germans from crossing. Several people were shot trying to swim in the river, he remembered. When the Russians finally came, Huggins learned only too well why the Germans had tried to flee in panic. I could hear women screaming all night in the towns across the river. They were from a Mongolian division and about as hard to control as a troop of monkeys. Chattering, they were into everything like children. Admire a weapon, and the holder would fire a burst at your feet to demonstrate. They were officered by white Russians who were almost as bad. I thought they were one rung above animals, the way they acted. After VE Day, the 97th Infantry Division was one of the first to be sent back to the United States so that they could be redeployed to the Pacific. Harry Koty was given a short furlough. Then it was off to Fort Bragg, where he received several weeks of additional training. Koty was already en route to the Pacific, having been shipped out from Seattle on a Russian ship when the atomic bombs were dropped and Japan surrendered. Instead of enduring more fighting, the 97th Infantry would now become an occupation force. Koty was given an enviable assignment. Because of a shortage of military police, he was taken out of the infantry and made an MP. Believe it or not, I had the best duty in Japan, Koty recalled. They stationed me on a guard duty at the Geisha houses, and for 3 months I lived with about 15 Geisha girls. Nonetheless, the 24-year-old Koty found he had a challenging duty. I had to keep the young GIs, most of them were 18 or 19 years old, out of the houses because there was a lot of venereal diseases going on at the time, and because there were also big shortages of medicines of all kinds because of the air raids. Although Japan had been devastated by Allied bombing, the Geisha girls were spared from the severe food shortages that gripped the rest of Japan. Somehow, the well-to-do Japanese businessmen would get steaks and other good food for the Geisha girls,
and I ate the steaks all right along right with them. It wasn't a bad assignment at all for a young Ohio boy. As the war in Europe ended, the elation of the U.S. soldiers was tempered by the knowledge that they still had Japan to deal with. Everyone knew an invasion of the Japanese homeland was going to be costly. Robert B. Nett of Columbus, Georgia, received the Medal of Honor for leading an attack against Japanese soldiers entrenched in a 3-story concrete building that became their fortress on Leyte Island in the Philippines. But his most vivid memory of the war was the elation he felt when Japan surrendered after the second atomic bomb was dropped. You see, that particular time our division had moved from Okinawa to Cebu in the Philippines, and we were training day and night for the invasion of Japan, and consequently we were well aware of the intelligence of the enemy that we were going to oppose, and it was estimated at the time that there would be 1 million Allied casualties before we had a strong foothold on the 5 major islands of Japan. In anticipation of enormous American casualties, 370,000 Purple Heart medals were ordered by the U.S. Army in preparation for the invasion. Thankfully, they weren't needed, because, as Roland Shump of Iowa City, Iowa, said,
"Good old Harry Truman took care of that. As I have said many times, if he hadn't dropped that bomb on Japan, I, along with my many others, would not be here today."
The 2 bombs obliterated both cities. In less than a second, the temperature rose to 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, vaporizing people for half a mile from ground zero. Even bronze statues melted. Radioactive rain began to fall. People living miles away still suffered horrible burns from the infrared energy unleashed. Instantly, 80,000 people were killed in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki. Almost all of them were civilians, men, women, and children who had never worn a uniform. Of those that were killed, 38,000 were children. There was no emergency response for the survivors, many of whom died painful deaths in the days, weeks, and months that followed. 42 of 45 hospitals were obliterated. 90% of all the physicians and nurses in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were killed. American journalist John Hersey arrived at Hiroshima 9 months after the bomb had been dropped. Hersey interviewed 6 survivors of the bomb, and he told their story in his brilliant book, Hiroshima, which was first published in the New Yorker. Father Kleinsorgen was a German Jesuit priest who was living in Hiroshima. Hersey told how Father Kleinsorgen did what he could for the wounded survivors, including looking for water. Father Kleinsorgen went to fetch water for the wounded in a bottle and a teapot that he had borrowed. He had heard that it was possible to get fresh tap water outside Asana Park. Going through the rock gardens, he had to climb over and crawl under the trunks of fallen pine trees. He found he was weak. There were many dead in the gardens. At a beautiful moon bridge, he passed a naked living woman who seemed to have been burned from head to toe and was red all over. Near the entrance to the park, an army doctor was working, but the only medicine he had was iodine, which he painted over cuts, bruises, slimy burns, everything, and by now everything he painted had pus on it. Outside the gate of the park, Father Kleinsorgen found a faucet that still worked, part of the plumbing of a vanished house, and he filled his vessels and he returned. When he had given the wounded the water, he made a second trip. This time the woman by the bridge was dead. On his way back with the water, he got lost on a detour around a fallen tree, and as he looked for his way through the woods, he heard a voice ask from the underbrush, "Have you anything to drink?" He saw a uniform. Thinking there was just one soldier, he approached with water. When he had penetrated the bushes, he saw there were about 20 men, and they were all in exactly the same nightmarish state. Their faces were wholly burned, their eye sockets were hollow, the fluid from their melted eyes had run down their cheeks. They must have had their faces upturned when the bomb went off. Perhaps they were anti-aircraft personnel. Their mouths were mere swollen, pus-covered wounds, which they could not bear to stretch enough to admit the spout of the teapot. So Father Kleinsorgen got a large piece of grass and drew out the stem so as to make a straw, and he gave them all water to drink in that way. The Reverend Mr. Kiyoshi Tanimoto attempted to make his way into the city, fearful for his family and his church. He soon found that he was the only person trying to go into the city, as he passed hundreds and hundreds who were fleeing from it. Every one of them seemed to be hurt in some way. The eyebrows of some were burned off, and the skin hung from their faces and hands. Others, because of pain, held their arms up as if carrying something in both hands. Some were vomiting as they walked. Many were naked or in shreds of clothing. On some undressed bodies, the burns had made patterns of undershirt straps and suspenders, and on the skin of some women, since white repelled the heat from the bomb and dark clothes absorbed it and conducted it into the skin, the shapes of flowers they had on their kimonos. Many, although injured themselves, supported relatives who were worse off. Almost all had their heads bowed, looking straight ahead, were silent, and showed no expression whatsoever. Dr. Sasaki was the sole uninjured doctor at the Red Cross Hospital. While 80,000 people had been killed instantly at Hiroshima, another 100,000 were wounded, 10,000 of whom staggered to the Red Cross Hospital, one of the only hospitals still standing. Nothing could have prepared Dr. Sasaki for trying to care for so many. Mixed in with the abrasions and the lacerations which most people in the hospital had suffered, he began to find dreadful burns. He realized then that the casualties were pouring in from outdoors. There were so many that he began to pass up the lightly wounded. He decided that all he could hope to do was to stop people from bleeding to death. Before long, patients lay and crouched on the floors of the wards and the laboratories and all the other rooms, and in the corridors and on the stairs and in the front hall and on the stone front steps and in the driveway and in the courtyard and for blocks each way in the streets outside. Wounded people supported maimed people. Disfigured families leaned together. Many people were vomiting. A tremendous number of schoolgirls, some of those who had been taken from their classrooms to work outdoors cleaning fire lanes, crept into the hospital. The people in the suffocating crowd inside the hospital wept and cried for Dr. Sasaki to hear, "Doctor!" In the days and weeks that followed, Dr. Sasaki found that survivors continued to die at high rates from the mysterious disease caused by the intense radiation. It had, they decided, 3 stages. The first stage had been all over before the doctors even knew they were dealing with a new sickness. It was a direct reaction to the bombardment of the body at the moment when the bomb went off by neutrons, beta particles, and gamma rays. The apparently uninjured people who had died so mysteriously in the first few hours or days had succumbed in this first stage. It killed 95% of the people within a half mile of the center, and many thousands who were further away. The doctors realized in retrospect that even though most of these dead had also suffered from burns and blast effects, they had absorbed enough radiation to kill them. The rays simply destroyed their body cells, caused their nuclei to degenerate, and broke their walls. Many people who did not die right away came down with nausea, headache, diarrhea, malaise, and fever, which lasted for several days. Doctors could not be certain whether some of these symptoms were the result of radiation or nervous shock. The second stage set in 10 to 15 days after the bombing. Its first symptom was falling hair. Diarrhea and fever, which in some cases went as high as 106, came next. 25 to 30 days after the explosion, blood disorders appeared. Gums bled. The white blood cell count dropped sharply, and eruptions appeared on the skin and mucous membranes. The drop in the number of white blood corpuscles reduced the patient's capacity to resist infection, so open wounds were unusually slow in healing, and many of the sick developed sore throats and mouths. The two key symptoms on which the doctors came to base their prognosis were fever and the lowered white corpuscle count. If fever remained steady and high, the patient's chances for survival were poor. The white count almost always dropped below 4,000. A patient whose count fell below 1,000 had little hope of living. Toward the end of the second stage, if the patient survived, anemia or a drop in the red blood cell count also set in. The third stage was the reaction that came when the body struggled to compensate for its ills. When, for instance, the white count not only returned to normal, but increased to much higher than normal levels. In this stage, many patients died of complications, such as infections in the chest cavity. Most burns healed with deep layers of pink rubbery scar tissue, known as tumors. The duration of the disease varied, depending on the patient's constitution and the amount of radiation that he had received. Some victims recovered in a week, while others with the disease dragged on for months. By the end of 1945, the dead from the bombing had risen to 140,000 people in Hiroshima and a further 74,000 in Nagasaki. Survivors would face leukemia, cancer of all kinds, and other terrible side effects from the radiation. Dr. Sasaki's anger towards the Americans who dropped the atomic bomb on his city and on Hiroshima only grew in the weeks and months that followed as he continued to care for the desperately sick and dying in unbearable conditions.
"I see," Dr. Sasaki said, "that they are holding a trial for war criminals in Tokyo just now. I think they ought to try the men who decided to use the bomb, and they should hang them all."
In the decades that followed, only one of the 90 American servicemen involved in the atomic bomb missions ever expressed regret for their actions. As late as 1989, Colonel Paul Tibbets, Jr., who commanded the Army Air Force's unit tasked with delivering the atomic bombs and piloted the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, defended his actions, stating, "I have never lost a night's sleep on the deal." Major Claude Etherly, the 26-year-old who piloted the advanced weather plane tasked with assessing target visibility over Hiroshima, who gave the go-ahead to drop the bomb, wasn't so lucky. Etherly was haunted by nightmares the rest of his life, and he sought treatment in and out of psychiatric treatment centers. As early as 1961, Etherly was quoted as saying that he rejected the idea that the bombs were necessary to save the lives of the American soldiers and Japanese civilians. He stated that by early August, the Japanese were putting up so little resistance that the war could have ended without the use of nuclear weapons. Many historians concur and have maintained that the bombs were really used as a show of force and a deterrent to the Soviet Union. Etherly would eventually send a message to the people of Hiroshima.
"I told them I was the major that gave the go-ahead to destroy Hiroshima, that I was unable to forget the act, and that the guilt of the act has caused me great suffering," Etherly reported to Anders. "I asked them to forgive me." 30 girls of Hiroshima, atomic bomb victims, left alive but scarred by the blast, responded, "We have learned to feel towards you a fellow feeling," they wrote, "thinking that you are also a victim of war like us." Etherly would eventually be given a Hiroshima Award
for his contributions to world peace. He died at the age of 59 of throat cancer in 1978 at a Texas VA hospital. Like the American servicemen involved in the atomic bomb missions, most World War II veterans seem to have supported the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They credited the atomic bombs with sparing their own lives and those of their buddies, and they didn't question the morality of the decisions. Joe Lawn of Port Lavaca, Texas, served as a gunner on a bomber that did not get the message to avoid the airspace near Nagasaki on the day the second atomic bomb was dropped.
We're not told to stay away from the area. After we got near Nagasaki, the funnel cloud shot spread out and rose straight up, and we were on the right side of it. The fall out of the cloud, plutonium was everywhere. The town below was smoking. It didn't seem to be any fire, or as everything was destroyed. As we were 10,000 feet up, you could not make out anything.
Despite his aerial view of the complete destruction of the bomb caused over Nagasaki, Lawn never doubted the wisdom of dropping the bombs.
I thank God that President Truman had the guts to drop the bomb. There would have been 500,000 Japanese and 500,000 Americans killed if we had to invade Japan. They were whipped, but had thousands of young Jap officers and civilians that were ready to die for the Emperor, and they were not ready to surrender.
Any doubts veterans may have had were often erased by the belief that the atomic bombs saved their lives and those of their buddies by ending the war sooner. Ralph Keller considered President Harry S. Truman the most important man in his lifetime because of his decision to drop the 2 atomic bombs on Japan.
I believe by him ordering this, he saved hundreds of thousands of American lives. Remember Pearl Harbor, and then decide whether this was right or wrong.
After VE Day, Rex Whitehead's platoon collected German POWs and kept them in the city jail in Würzburg, Germany, until they were shipped to POW camps. Whitehead stayed in a German home, and he enjoyed the hospitality, but he wasn't there for long. In June, he was shipped back to the U.S. to begin preparations to go to the Pacific with the 12th Infantry Division. He thanked the atomic bombs with saving his life.
The beautiful bombs were dropped while I was at home, or perhaps this letter would continue for several pages telling about invading Japan, the number of men we lost, and the millions we would kill. Dropping the bombs was the finest thing that ever happened in my life. Everything else since is due to the use of them. If we had had one and used it on March 7th, 1945, I would not have had to cross the Ludendorff Bridge, and many, many thousands of Americans would have been saved.
James Spaulding was still in the Philippines training for the invasion in Japan when the bomb was dropped. He too recognized that the dropping of the atomic bombs may have spared his life.
It was pretty good news when we heard that. We were fixing to set sail for an invasion, somewhere off the island of Japan. I'm sure it would have been a pretty rough landing.
Despite the hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilian deaths caused by the dropping of the atomic bombs, a few veterans argued that at least some Japanese lives were saved as a result. Dwayne Stevens of Simi Valley, California, credited the atomic bombs with saving an unknown number of civilian lives.
You have to know about the Japanese obsession with saving face to understand this statement. Japanese civilians on Saipan threw their children off a cliff to die on the rocks below, and they jumped off after them rather than be captured by the Americans.
Stevens had been in the European theater, but he did spend several months with the occupation forces in Japan after the Japanese surrender. However, a few veterans objected to the use of the atomic bombs and the terrible toll they took on civilians, which would almost certainly be considered a war crime today. As one of the youngest men to serve in World War II, he lied about his age and enlisted at the age of 16, Raymond E. Comro arguably had the most to live for at the end of World War II. But that didn't stop Comro from believing it was wrong for the U.S. to have dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He wrote, "The U.S. never should have dropped another atomic bomb, even if it did save American lives by not going ashore to invade Japan." Comro considered the bombing to be a dirty attack, since they wiped out so many innocent Japanese civilians. The dropping of the atomic bombs did result in Japan's announcing its unconditional surrender on August 14, 1945, though the surrender was not formalized until several weeks later. By that time, Charles Wysocki was already back home in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. After the Tinian battle, Wysocki had been sent home suffering from combat fatigue and a rare blood disease. VJ Day was like nothing he had ever seen before.
There was quite a celebration in downtown Milwaukee. I wasn't quite in the mood to celebrate, but I was swept up by the crowd, and I had no choice. Many of the young ladies in the crowd just took over, and when I finally was able to get away and get home, I looked like I went through another battle. I was covered with lipstick, powder, and confetti. I was very happy that the war was over, and my buddies would be coming home soon.
2 weeks later, Japanese officials signed the formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, just off of Yokohama, Japan. James Spaulding was in the harbor when the peace treaty was signed. Afterwards, Spaulding recalled it felt a little like the 4th of July, with soldiers shooting off their rifles. VJ Day meant the war was over at last. Johnny would soon be marching home. After 26 months, Spaulding couldn't wait to get back to the U.S. and to his young bride, Eva May, who had spent his absence living with his parents in Searcy, Arkansas.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki paid a big price for their sins. When scourged from the face of earth, their battle could not win. But on that day of judgment, when comes a greater power, we will not know the minute, and we will not know the hour. Atomic power.
Our song today, Atomic Power, was written by Fred Kirby shortly after the bombing of Hiroshima and warned about its misuse. If you liked this podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, please leave us a review on whatever podcast network you use. Follow our podcasts and tell your friends. New episodes come out bi-weekly. You can find the companion book on Amazon.com. Until next time, thank you for remembering our World War II veterans.